I was growing up, we didn't have the internet because it was still the Stone Age. There was pterodactyls in the sky. It was a dark time. We learned about horror movies primarily through word of mouth, television listings, movies on television, and the few books that were on the market that were both reference books and just entertainment books about the horror genre, or more specifically, usually monster movies, because that term was actually a lot more common at that time. Now, I'm not going to split hairs about monster movies versus horror movies. They're really meant to describe the same thing. Movies intended to produce anxiety, fear, gallows humor, that range of emotions out of a viewer. And for those of us who are drawn to this form of entertainment, you couldn't really get enough information out there. There wasn't some master list available like there is today. I mean, you can literally just go to horror films as a Wikipedia entry, and from there you can branch out into every subgenre, every decade, every year, every director, every actor who's ever appeared in a horror film, and you can get all the information you'd ever need. And that was not the case when I was growing up. We had so few resources. If you're lucky enough to know someone older than you that was into horror movies, perhaps they would tell you about movies, and the chances of you ever being able to see those movies was pretty slight. Have to remember, this is before the days where VHS players were in every home. We were really at the mercy of convenience and coincidence. So books about the genre were really, really important because they're something that you could hold on to and you could read as many times as you need. You could memorize all the content. You could learn about all kinds of films that your chances of seeing might have seemed very thin. But you could dream about them. You could spend your days daydreaming about all these magical, wonderful, horrifying, disgusting movies that you may never get to see. And to a large extent, that made it even more special when you actually were able to see some of these movies. And yeah, they didn't always live up to your expectations. In fact, maybe they couldn't live up to your expectations after all of that build-up. But it was such a rarity to be able to just see a horror movie. You know, today, with the streaming options and the cable options and the satellite options, you can pretty much watch horror whenever you want. That was not the case in the late 70s and early 80s. You were pretty much confined to what was being programmed at your local television station, usually a UHF station. Either in the middle of an afternoon if you were looking for like older monster movies, or the harder horror films would be later at night, and sometimes very late at night. So these books that were out there that were available were so important. And I think an entire generation of horror fans owes pretty much their entire fandom to these books because it kept feeding the fire inside us when there wasn't much else. Now, I know some of you are probably wondering, what about Fangoria? Fangoria started in 1979, so while it does eventually play a role, it comes a little too late for those of us who were born when I was born. And also launching at the last year of the 70s, Fangoria initially was a fantasy magazine with a focus on horror. The first few issues had as much fantasy and science fiction as they did horror. So it took a few years for it even really to come into what we think of as Fangoria. Now, before Fangoria, there was Famous Monsters of Filmland and Castle of Frankenstein. There was other fanzines. If you lived in a big city, I guess that was good news for you. I did not. So finding any of those fanzines was unlikely. And certainly not a casual event. You couldn't just go to your local bookstore and find them. I want to feature today one of the books that got me through those early years that I still own. And that's the movie Treasury horror movies. Now, this was a series that focused on a lot of different genres. There was a different book for each of it. And just look at that beautiful cover. And we got the great Christopher Lee on the back. I'm going to take you through this book. I'm not really going to stop on many pages. I'll have things to say. But I just wanted you to be able to see one of the resources I had growing up that really fed my fire and made me into the fan I am today. Again, Christopher Lee and Bela Lugosi. These photos meant so much to me as a kid. Again, you couldn't just dial up the movies. So every photo to me was its entire own story. It was something else I could just imagine. And hope that I'd be able to see these movies. There was no guarantees. I think I've seen probably everything in them now, but I will tell you that it didn't seem like that was going to be the case for a long time. For very many years, I figured that chances of seeing all these films were very, very, very slight. And it's just cool that the world we live in today exists and we have all these resources, but it's also a little bit of a shame because some of the passion that comes with obscurity and having to hunt and watch some 1 a.m. broadcast on a UHF station that only partially comes in on your rabbit ears antenna, well, it made things more special. It made things more precious, and I think that we cared more. We're also a lot more forgiving. I wonder if we'd be as hypercritical of the movies that are coming out today if they were still big events, seminal events. Obviously, this book focused very heavily on the 60s and 70s because that would have been the most current batch of films out there. And that's actually a good thing because in many ways, this is the era that is becoming increasingly ignored. It used to be the late 40s and early 50s were routinely ignored. Now I'm finding that the early 70s are becoming lost, and basically until you get to Dawn of the Dead and Suspiria, Alien, at the end of the decade, the mid to end of the decade, you really don't have the focus of many horror fans on the era that came before. I think the 30s have endured, the Universal 30s have endured pretty well, and they are very represented here too. But their flyover horror, which is a term I use to describe that period, really between, 48 and 69, traditionally, is probably more like, unfortunately, mid-70s now is where it ends. And that's a real shame. As a kid, these images, these incredibly attractive women and these gothic counts, these vampires and these werewolves and these mummies, this was all really, really stoking my imagination. More than anything, I wanted to see these films. You can't probably get a beat for that if you were born in the internet era, because again, the access to these movies is so readily available now, but it wasn't then. One of my all-time favorite films, my favorite Hammer film, Twins of Evil. But every page, every photograph was special to me, and you can see how creased every page of this book is, because I pored over this book. And this book doesn't have a lot of text, and the text it has is pretty simplistic. You can tell that the writer knew his stuff, but he understood that this book was being sold 100% on these photographs. As it should be, really. As the movies get a little bit later on and we start to get to its Amicus and Hammer and we get towards the mid-70s and things are getting more modern, you'll notice that the text is actually becoming more lengthy and the photographs are a little bit less. This is probably because the newer films were not licensing out the photos for free and they didn't really want to pay for this stuff. So it does definitely lean into older. Also, this is a good time to mention that one of the things I feel has been sorely missing from modern horror is a sense of the Gothic. Is there anything more beautiful to a horror fan? somehow we've gotten away from Gothic imagery in our films. The Great Barbara Steele in Curse of the Crimson Idol. Particular favorite, based on an H.P. Lovecraft story, Dreams in the Witch House. But we've gotten away from this beautiful Gothic imagery that made so much of the horror genre compelling and a great example of visual storytelling. And unfortunately, I think that the lack of Gothic sensibilities is leading us kind of to that sameness that we're feeling almost all the time when we go to the theaters. I think if we had still that beauty and darkness as a reoccurring theme in horror, like we did, even like neo-Gothicism, something like Psycho, it still had that essential part of the formula, and we have less of that. Now, we do occasionally get it. A film like The Dark and the Wicked had it. So it's not completely extinct, but it's definitely endangered. There was some elements in Talk to Me of Gothic imagery. Just, I felt not enough. It's still a great film. I wouldn't take a thing away from it. But I do miss when horror films still had a legacy of the Gothic tradition. As we get to the kaiju section, although it does not call it that, it's interesting because that seems to be where the author believes the genre is headed. And he's not entirely wrong, but I don't think he could have foreseen just how much the slasher revolution would change horror. And there's some really great slasher films, but slasher films left not a lot of oxygen in the room for anything else. So unfortunately, it kind of closed the book on the Gothic era of horror. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the book. My childhood is probably different than yours. That's okay. No generation should have the same exact experience. I hope, though, that I can learn from younger people's experiences, and like I learned from the people that were a generation above me, and their passion for movies that, you know, I guess I was supposed to think were outdated and old and frumpy, but I didn't. Because I think you have to love all this. You have to love the whole era of horror from 1890s to today. Not saying you have to love everything that the genre's ever produced, because I certainly don't. But if you don't love all the eras, you're just missing out. And it would be a shame. Without books like this, I don't know if I would have gotten to this place, and I definitely wouldn't have sought out every film I could have. I'm hoping you have something like that in your life. Take care.